Debate, and the Honourable Member for Newmarket, Aurora.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will be sharing my time with the member from Sydney, Victoria. Mr. Speaker, I'm speaking to you today from the traditional territories of the Wendat Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe people and the treaty land of the Williams Treaty First Nation. And I'm pleased to rise today to discuss Bill C-15, an act respecting the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. Our government has been clear. We are committed to renewing the relationship between the Crown and the Indigenous peoples based on recognition, rights, respect, cooperation, partnership, and advancing reconciliation. Earlier this week, I rose in the House to speak about how our government is fighting systemic racism in the judicial system with Bill C-22. And I'm proud to rise again today to speak to how the implementation of Bill C-15 is a step forward in protecting the human rights of Indigenous peoples and fighting systemic racism. In Canada, across the globe, citizens are debating the nature and the promise of equity in our time. They are rightfully and urgently demanding change to fight systemic racism in our society. Human rights are universal and inherent to all human beings, and this bill is another sign of the progress we are making in affirming human rights and addressing the systemic racism present in this country. The United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples affirms the minimum standards for survival, dignity, and the well-being of Indigenous peoples. Article 1 of the UN Declaration recognizes that Indigenous peoples have the right of full enjoyment as a collective or as individuals of all human rights and fundamental freedoms, and that includes the right to self-government and self-determination. In addition, the UN Declaration sets out rights and standards that draw on universal rights norms, but speak more specifically to the circumstances of the world's 370 million Indigenous peoples. The recognition of Indigenous rights is at the core of our government's commitment to build the relationship with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. This is why our government has introduced Bill C-15. The wait for equal respect and the human rights of Indigenous people has been far too long and has taken far too many generations. As part of our commitment to engage and collaborate with Indigenous peoples, this legislation is the culmination of work with Indigenous rights holders and organizations over many months past. We understand the importance of building on the work that has already been done to advance the implementation of the Declaration in Canada. This is explicitly acknowledged in the preamble, which recognizes that provincial, territorial, and municipal governments have the ability to establish their own approaches to implement the Declaration. And indeed, several have already taken steps in their own areas of authority to do so. We are ready to work with all levels of governments, Indigenous peoples, and other sectors of society to achieve the goals outlined in the Declaration and supported by this bill. We have also included a provision that specifically notes that the bill does not delay the application of the Declaration in Canadian law. Achieving the objectives of the Declaration and further aligning federal laws with the Declaration will take time. However, we're not starting from scratch, and we continue to advance recent and ongoing priorities and initiatives, which contribute to the implementation of the Declaration in parallel to the process and the measures required by the bill. We have also responded to calls for clearer and more robust provisions of the process for developing and tabling an action plan and annual reports. These updates are incredibly important, and the action plan is a central pillar of this legislation. Developing and implementing the action plan means working together to address the injustices, combat prejudice, and eliminate all forms of violence and discrimination, including systemic discrimination against Indigenous peoples. To promote respect, mutual understanding, as well as good relations, including human rights education. To include measures that relate to monitoring, oversight, recourse, or remedy, or other accountability with respect to the implementation of the Declaration, and to include measures to review and amend the action plan. With this legislation, we will find the Government of Canada's 2016 endorsement of the Declaration without qualification, while also responding to the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry calls for justice and continuing progress on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls of action. There is no doubt that passing this legislation will help us move in a direction that we all want. Over the past few years, this government has taken a number of steps and measures consistent with the rights framework of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People and the Canadian Charter. We are beginning to see positive changes happening, including steps to strengthen restorative justice, access to justice and diversion programs, and reform to our criminal justice system. The Government of Canada, alongside provinces and territories, is developing a pan-Canadian strategy to address the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the criminal justice system. Working on this strategy also includes close collaboration with Indigenous communities and organizations. We're also implementing impact of race and culture assessments, which allow sentencing judges to consider disadvantages of systemic racism that contributed to Indigenous peoples and racialized Canadians' interactions with the criminal justice system. We are putting in place community justice center pilot projects in British Columbia, Manitoba, and Ontario, as well as consultations to help expand community justice center concept to other provinces and territories. Among other initiatives, we are also developing the administration of justice agreements with Indigenous communities to strengthen community-based justice systems and support self-determination. I believe this initiative to be especially important. It recognizes that Indigenous peoples have to be part of the solution, and the capacity is there to improve justice with Indigenous communities. Bill C-15 is a significant step forward, but alone it will not achieve our collective goal of transformative change for the Indigenous people. There will be much work to do together after royal assent to develop an inclusive and effective approach to realize the full potential of the Declaration. As a result of the additional efforts and measures to implement the UN Declaration will be needed, and as I have just listed, the Government of Canada has begun work on additional efforts and measures. Certainly, there is much more work to do to support Indigenous communities to a better state of health and insecurity, but these are important steps forward. And while the important national work is taking place, Canada will continue ongoing discussions with Indigenous peoples to make progress together on our shared priorities for upholding human rights, advancing reconciliation, exercising self-determination, closing socioeconomic gaps, and eliminating systemic barriers facing First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Mr. Speaker, change is happening. Our government and our society is evolving as we learn the importance of doing things differently in a way that is better and fairer for all of us. Implementing the UN Declaration is something that Indigenous people in Canada have long called for, and it is a change we want to see come to fruition. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. We'll first go to the Honourable Member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member from Newmarket, Aurora, for his speech. Recently I was at a forestry conference and heard a respected First Nations leader, a leader who's very much involved in ensuring that his people benefit from the natural resources in their territory. And when asked about UNDRIP, he said that it's important to understand that UNDRIP does not give First Nations people rights. The United Nations hasn't given First Nations people rights. It simply sets out the rights that those Indigenous people already have. I'm just wondering if you could comment on that and the conservative concerns I hear that somehow this bill, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People will somehow curtail the rights of First Nations to access the natural resources on their territories.
For Newmarket, Aurora.
Thank you. I want to thank the member for his question, and I agree. It's an affirmation of rights that exist. I think the real benefit in this document and in our discussion is that it's developing a conversation to address these issues. And I've heard people say that this is an aspirational document. Well, without any aspiration, we're not going to accomplish anything. So we need to set out some shared goals. And I hope and I believe that the comments that I've made have outlined those shared goals. And it's the goals of equity, fairness, and working towards that. So I think we share the objective and the principle of making this a better, kinder, gentler nation.
Questions et commentaires? Questions and comments? L'honorable député de Shepherd.
Questions and comments? The member for Shepherd. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Some people will say that the implementation of this declaration would give First Nations a veto for any natural resource development project. So I'd like to hear my colleague, and thank you to him for his speech, why this would not be the case and why C-15 is aligned with good negotiations.
Bill C-15 sets out a framework for dialogue and collaboration and working together. And frankly, if we don't do that, we're going to have a far more cumbersome way on accomplishing anything. And so if this document creates a framework for dialogue, a framework for free, prior, and informed decisions for all parties, we'll come to better decisions.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the honourable member for his speech. The Green Party has been calling for the implementation of UNDRIP for a long time. It's unfortunate that we have time allocation on this because I think that it is part of our democratic process to have a fulsome debate in the House of Commons on important bills like this. The British Columbia government implemented legislation on UNDRIP, and shortly after we saw the conflict explode in Wet'suwet'en. We've seen them ignoring the complaints of West Moberly and Prophet River First Nation with Site C. We've seen revenue sharing agreements that have silencers on them so that members can't speak out in their community. We've seen those agreements leaked, and we know that this is happening with old growth logging in British Columbia now too, and we see division in the Pachadat community. And it seems like the colonial project of resource extraction continues on, whether we have UNDRIP legislation in British Columbia or not. And I'd like to ask the honourable member how he sees UNDRIP unfolding in Canada, and whether we will see a more fulsome process for free, prior, and informed consent on these projects, and to ensure that people in these communities are not silenced by revenue sharing agreements that are set up by the government.
The honourable member for Newmarket Aurora.
Thank you. As a democracy, we're not always going to find ourselves agreeing on everything. And I think what's important here is that we're building a framework for dialogue, a framework for discussion. And again, I'm going back to free, prior, and informed discussions. I think that will improve our relationship. It will strengthen our country, and it will strengthen the fabric of the values that we hold across this country. So I think that it's becoming a basis for better dialogue and a basis for developing collaboration.